The silence was the first warning, though no one recognized it as such. Private Thomas Brennan pressed his back against the muddy trench wall and listened to the absence of sound. For 2 years, the Western Front had screamed with artillery fire, the thunder of explosions shaking the earth day and night until men forgot what quiet felt like. But that September morning in 1917, along the Menin Road near Ypres, the guns had stopped. The eerie calm settled over the British trenches like a held breath, and Thomas felt his skin prickle with unease. He was 22 years old, but looked 40. The trenches aged men fast. Before the war, he had worked in a Manchester factory, his hands already calloused from machinery, his future predictable and small. He had volunteered in 1915 with dreams of glory, of doing something that mattered. Those dreams had died in the mud of the Somme. Now he carried a small notebook in his breast pocket where he sketched the faces of dead men, believing that someone should remember them when the war ground their bodies into the Belgian soil. Corporal Davies climbed up beside him, squinting toward the German lines across no man's land. The morning sun was just burning through the clouds, casting long shadows across the churned earth. Davies was a Welsh coal miner who had survived Passchendaele, and his instincts had kept their section alive more times than Thomas could count. When Davies went still, his weathered face tightening, Thomas knew something was wrong. "You see that?" Davies pointed toward the distant German trenches. A fog was rolling toward them, low to the ground, moving with an unnatural slowness that made Thomas's stomach clench. But it was not the white mist that sometimes rose from the shell-cratered swamp of no man's land. This fog glowed yellow-brown in the morning light, thick and oily-looking, hugging the earth like something alive. Thomas heard other men noticing it now, voices rising in confusion along the trench line. Some thought it was morning fog mixed with smoke from burning buildings in the ruined villages beyond. Private Ellis, barely 19 and still soft-faced despite months in the trenches, laughed nervously and said it looked like mustard. The boy had no idea how prophetic his observation was. Mustard gas. The Germans called it Gelbkreuz, or Yellow Cross, after the markings on the artillery shells that delivered it. The British called it HS, for Hun stuff, or simply the worst thing yet invented in a war already drowning in new methods of killing. The gas crept closer, and Thomas caught the first whiff of its scent. Sweet, almost pleasant, like garlic or horseradish. Nothing like the choking chlorine attacks he had heard about from the men who survived Ypres in 1915. This was different, subtle, almost innocent. That was exactly what made it so deadly. Chlorine gas announced itself with suffocating clouds that men could see and flee from. Mustard gas was patient. It did not need to kill immediately. It could wait. Davy suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "Gas! Gas! Get your masks!" The warning rippled down the trench line, men scrambling for the respirators that hung around their necks. Thomas grabbed his mask, the rubber already sticky with sweat and dirt, and pulled it over his face. The world narrowed to the fogged glass eyepieces and the sound of his own ragged breathing. Around him, men fumbled with straps and filters, some getting their masks on in seconds, others panicking as the yellow cloud rolled over the trench lip and sank down among them like water pouring into a boat. Ellis could not find his mask. The boy tore through his gear, his movements becoming frantic as the gas settled around his legs. He gasped, inhaling deeply in his panic, and Thomas saw the exact moment the poison entered the young private's lungs. Ellis's eyes went wide, his hands flying to his throat. Thomas lurched toward him, but Sergeant Morrison grabbed his arm. "It's too late," Morrison said, his voice muffled by his own mask. "Help the ones you can save." The gas filled the communication trenches now, seeping into dugouts and shell holes. It had no mercy, no preferences. It found every man who had not gotten his mask on fast enough, every patch of exposed skin where uniforms had gaps, every place where sweat had soaked through fabric. Thomas felt a burning sensation on his chin where he had touched his face before securing his mask. The contamination was already spreading. Within the hour, the true horror began to reveal itself. Mustard gas was not designed to kill quickly like bullets or shrapnel. The Germans had calculated something far more terrible. Men started coughing violently, their airways constricting. Eyes swelled shut, leaving soldiers blind and helpless. Blisters erupted across skin, growing larger and more agonizing with each passing minute. Ellis collapsed in the trench, his lungs filling with fluid, drowning from the inside. Thomas watched the boy die slowly, unable to help, unable to look away. The medical dugout quickly overflowed with screaming, blind, blistered men, and still the gas lingered, soaking into the wooden trench supports, the sandbags, the very earth itself. Thomas pulled out his notebook with shaking hands and tried to sketch Ellis's face before the blisters made him unrecognizable. The pencil trembled. The page was already spotted with yellowish residue. Around him, men began to understand that this was not an attack they could fight or survive through courage. This was industrial murder, efficient and impersonal. And the Germans might attack at any moment while they were weak, blind, and dying. Thomas looked at the contaminated walls surrounding them and realized they were trapped in a tomb of their own making, choking on the future of warfare. Death arrived slowly after the gas, and that was the cruelty of it. 24 hours after the attack, Thomas Brennan stood in what had become a field hospital carved into hell itself. The trench that had been his home for 3 months was now a gallery of suffering unlike anything he had imagined war could produce. Mustard gas did not grant the mercy of quick endings. It worked its way through the body with methodical patience, destroying tissue, blinding eyes, collapsing lungs, leaving men conscious and aware as their own bodies turned against them. Thomas's face burned where he had touched contaminated skin before securing his mask. Blisters had formed around his mouth and chin, painful but not debilitating. His eyes stung constantly, his vision blurred at the edges. But he could still function, which made him one of the lucky ones. The truly fortunate had gotten their masks on fast enough to avoid exposure entirely. The unlucky ones were dying in the medical dugout, and there were so many unlucky ones. Captain Whitmore, the battalion medical officer, had not slept since the attack. His uniform was stained with the yellowish fluid that wept from gas blisters, his hands trembling from exhaustion as he moved between patients. Whitmore had trained in London hospitals before the war, had treated every conventional wound that modern warfare produced. Bullets, shrapnel, gangrene, shell shock, he knew them all. But mustard gas created injuries that defied his medical training. The chemical burned through skin and layers, creating blisters that could cover entire bodies. It destroyed mucous membranes in the eyes, nose, throat, and lungs. Men developed pneumonia within hours as their damaged airways filled with fluid. There were not enough bandages, not enough morphine, not enough hands to provide care. Private Ellis had survived the first night, though Thomas wished he had not. The boy lay on a stretcher in the dugout, completely blind, his skin covered in blisters that had merged into sheets of raw, weeping flesh. He cried constantly, calling for his mother in a voice made hoarse by his damaged throat. Thomas sat with him during his breaks from guard duty, reading letters from Ellis's sweetheart in Cornwall. The letters spoke of wedding plans and a cottage by the sea. Ellis whispered that Thomas should write to her, tell her the engagement was off. "I can't let her see me like this," he said, his blind eyes weeping pus instead of tears. "Tell her I died quick. Tell her I didn't suffer." But Ellis was suffering, and there was no end in sight. Mustard gas could take days or weeks to kill. The Germans had understood something profound and terrible about modern warfare. A dead soldier was a statistic, but a wounded soldier was a burden. Every gas casualty required doctors, nurses, orderlies, stretcher bearers, ambulances, hospital beds, medicines, and time. Every screaming, blinded man drained resources and shattered morale. The Germans did not need to break through the British line. The gas had already broken the men defending it. Orders came down to evacuate the most serious cases to the casualty clearing station 8 miles behind the lines. But moving the wounded meant touching their blistered skin, lifting them onto stretchers, carrying them over rough ground. Every movement caused agony. Sergeant Morrison, who had led their section through 2 years of combat with unfailing courage, was now one of the men on a stretcher. He had seemed fine immediately after the gas attack, but his lungs had been damaged. Now he coughed blood with increasing frequency, his breathing growing more labored by the hour. "This isn't war anymore," he told Thomas in a moment of lucidity. "This is just murder that takes longer." The Germans began shelling the British positions that afternoon, knowing they were weakened. Thomas and the other partially functional men scrambled to defend the trench while caring for the injured. He fired his rifle with blistered hands, the pain so intense it made his vision white out. Each shot sent agony through his damaged skin. The contradiction of it all struck him with bitter clarity. They were supposed to kill the enemy, while their own weapon killed them from within. The gas did not care about nationality or courage or who was right. It consumed everything equally in the chaos of the shelling. Thomas discovered something that made his blood run cold. Corporal Davies, who had spotted the gas cloud first and saved so many lives with his warning, was now coughing up blood. His lungs were failing. Davies had gotten his mask on quickly, had seemed unaffected, but mustard gas was patient. It had found microscopic tears in his mask seal, or perhaps he had breathed contaminated air while taking the mask off to eat. There was no safety, no protection that worked completely. The gas kept working days after the initial attack, a poison that lived in the trench walls, the sandbags, the very air. Captain Whitmore explained it to Thomas during a brief moment between crises. Mustard gas was designed to be persistent. It could remain active for days, even weeks, depending on weather and temperature. Every surface in the contaminated trenches was now a potential source of exposure. Men who touched walls without gloves developed blisters. Water in shell holes dissolved the chemical and splashed it onto anyone who fell. Even the dead bodies scattered in no man's land had absorbed the gas and would burn the skin of anyone who tried to recover them. The entire battlefield had become weaponized. Ellis died that night, still blind, still calling for his mother, his lungs finally drowning in their own fluid. Thomas held the boy's hand at the end, feeling the heat of infection radiating from blistered skin. He tried to sketch Ellis's face in his notebook afterward, but his damaged eyes could not focus properly, and the drawing came out distorted, unrecognizable. He wondered if this was how the war would remember all of them. Distorted, unrecognizable, reduced to suffering without names or faces. The evacuation began the next morning. Thomas was ordered to help carry stretchers. His own wounds marked him as walking wounded, functional enough to work, but damaged enough to need eventual treatment. He looked at Morrison's stretcher, at Davies gasping for breath, at the dozens of other men whose bodies were failing them slowly. The true horror of mustard gas was not in how it killed, but in how it kept men alive long enough to understand their own destruction. The journey to the casualty clearing station was 8 miles through landscape that looked like the surface of a dead planet. Thomas Brennan and 3 other walking wounded carried Sergeant Morrison's stretcher across ground so thoroughly destroyed by 3 years of warfare that no trace of Belgium remained visible beneath the mud and shell craters. Every step sent fire through the blisters on Thomas's feet, the broken skin inside his boots making him bite his tongue to keep from crying out. But Morrison was worse. The sergeant lay on the stretcher with his eyes swollen shut, his breath coming in wet, rattling gasps that meant his lungs were filling with fluid. He was dying, and they all knew it, but they carried him anyway because leaving a man behind was unthinkable even when everything else had become unthinkable. The path took them past shell holes filled with stagnant water that glowed with an oily sheen. Mustard gas dissolved in water, Captain Whitmore had explained, turning every puddle and crater into a reservoir of poison. The bodies of men and horses killed in previous battles lay half submerged in the contaminated pools, their flesh stained yellow-brown. Even the air tasted metallic and wrong. Thomas saw other groups of stretcher-bearers moving like ghosts through the wasteland, all carrying the wounded toward medical facilities that were already overwhelmed. This was the hidden cost of chemical warfare that generals never calculated. The massive infrastructure required to handle casualties who could not die quickly. The casualty clearing station was a collection of tents and converted farm buildings 3 miles behind the front lines, theoretically beyond the range of German artillery, but close enough to still hear the guns. When Thomas and his group arrived, they found men lying on stretchers in the mud outside because there was no room indoors. The sound was overwhelming, a constant chorus of coughing, moaning, screaming. Some men called for water. Others called for their mothers. A few called for death. Sister Margaret Hayes emerged from one of the tents, her nursing uniform splattered with blood and the yellowish discharge from gas blisters. She was from Edinburgh, a volunteer who had worked with the medical corps since 1915 and had seen every horror the war produced. But even she looked shaken by the mustard gas casualties. "Take him to Tent 3, she told Thomas, gesturing at Morrison's stretcher. "The lung cases. We'll do what we can." What they could do was not much. Thomas learned this as he helped Sister Hayes with basic care, holding men down while she cleaned wounds, fetching water and bandages that were never enough. Mustard gas destroyed the body's ability to heal itself. The blisters became infected almost immediately. The lung damage was often permanent. Many men would never see again. Those with severe chemical burns would be scarred and disfigured for life. Sister Hayes worked with brutal efficiency, making split-second decisions about who received treatment first. Men with the worst burns often could not be saved, but they needed the most care. Men with lung damage might survive with oxygen and medication, but supplies were severely limited. She was essentially choosing who would live and who would die, and Thomas saw her hands shake as she made those choices. "The bastards knew exactly what they were doing," she said to Thomas as they cleaned a soldier whose entire back was covered in merged blisters. "Mustard gas doesn't kill most of the men it hits. It just destroys them slowly. Creates maximum casualties with minimum lethality. It's the most efficient weapon ever invented, if you measure efficiency by suffering produced per shell fired." A group of German prisoners arrived that afternoon, carried on British stretchers, their gray uniforms stained with the same yellowish fluid as British uniforms. They had been caught in a British gas attack that went wrong when the wind shifted. These men had the same injuries, the same pain, the same desperate need for treatment. Sister Hayes moved among them without hesitation, cleaning wounds and administering morphine with the same care she gave British soldiers. Some British wounded protested weakly, but she silenced them with a look. "They're patients now," she said. "That's all that matters here." Thomas found himself standing beside a German boy who could not have been more than 17, blind and dying from lung damage exactly like Private Ellis. The boy whispered words in German that Thomas could not understand, but the fear and pain needed no translation. A German medical orderly, himself blistered and burned, translated. The boy was asking if his mother had been notified, if she knew he was dying. Thomas had no answer. He watched the German boy die that evening, the same fluid-filled drowning that had killed Ellis, and understood with crushing clarity that mustard gas had erased every meaningful distinction between them. The uniform was different, but the death was identical. Sergeant Morrison died during the night. Thomas sat with him at the end, listening to the wet sounds of his breathing gradually slow and stop. Morrison had been 34 years old, a veteran of the Somme and Passchendaele, a man who had kept their section alive through 2 years of impossible combat. He had survived machine gun fire, artillery bombardments, trench raids, and the collapse of whole sections of the line. But he could not survive a weapon that killed from the inside, that turned the body's own tissues against themselves. In his final moments, Morrison gripped Thomas's hand and whispered, "Remember this. Remember what this is. Make sure people know." The doctor examined Thomas the next morning, checking his blisters and testing his lungs. "You'll survive," he said with the detached certainty of a man who had made that judgment 1,000 times. "The burns will heal, though you'll have scars. Your lungs are damaged but functional. You should be sent home to recover." Thomas felt a surge of hope, brief and bright. Home, away from this. But then the doctor added, almost as an afterthought, "Your battalion is being rebuilt with replacement troops. You'll rejoin them in 2 weeks when they return to the line. 2 weeks. The same trenches, contaminated with gas. The same possibility of another attack. The same certainty that mustard gas would be used again by both sides in an escalating spiral of chemical warfare. Thomas looked at his notebook, at the sketches of dead men that filled its pages, at the new names he would need to add. He thought about the German boy calling for his mother, about Ellis and Morrison and Davies, about all the men lying in tents around him who would never fully recover. And he understood that surviving mustard gas meant carrying its truth forward, that humanity had created something more terrible than death and chosen to use it again and again. October brought rain to Flanders, and with it came Thomas Brennan's return to the trenches. His battalion had been rebuilt with fresh troops shipped from England, boys with clean uniforms and unmarked faces who still believed the war could be won through courage and determination. They did not understand why Thomas and the other gas survivors moved carefully through the trenches, checking their respirators obsessively, why they flinched at every strange smell on the wind. The new men had been taught about chemical warfare in training camps, had practiced putting on gas masks in controlled environments, but they had never watched a friend drown in his own lungs or seen skin blister and peel away in sheets. They thought they were prepared. Thomas knew they were not. The trenches they returned to were the same ones that had been gassed 3 weeks earlier, and the contamination lingered. Mustard gas soaked into wood and fabric, into the very earth itself, remaining potent for weeks depending on weather and temperature. Men who touched certain sections of trench wall without gloves developed burns. Water that collected in low spots was still toxic. The battalion command issued new protocols, extensive decontamination procedures, restricted areas marked with warning signs, mandatory glove wearing when handling any material that might have been exposed. But Thomas knew these measures were incomplete. Mustard gas was patient and unpredictable. It waited in places no one expected and found every gap in protection. Thomas had been promoted to acting corporal to replace Morrison, though the promotion felt hollow. He was 22 years old and responsible for training boys barely younger than himself in how to survive weapons that defied survival. He showed them how to secure gas masks in under 6 seconds. He explained the difference between chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas, how each one killed differently, how none of them granted mercy. But he could not explain the terror of watching Ellis claw at his throat or the guilt of being healthy while better men died slowly. Those lessons could only be learned through experience, and Thomas prayed these new soldiers would never have to learn them. He connected with other gas survivors, men from different battalions who had endured similar attacks. They formed an informal brotherhood, recognizing each other by scarred skin and damaged lungs, by the way they coughed in the cold morning air or rubbed their eyes that never stopped burning completely. Private Miller had survived a chlorine attack at 2nd Ypres in 1915 and still struggled to breathe deeply. Lance Corporal Webb had been caught in a phosgene cloud at the Somme and could not run without his chest seizing up. These men understood that chemical weapons had created a new category of soldier. Those who survived, but would never be whole, who would carry the war in their body for the rest of their lives. A captured German officer was brought through the trenches under guard one afternoon, a captain with an iron cross and burns on his hand from handling his own gas equipment. The new British soldiers wanted to kill him, screaming that he was responsible for their friends' deaths, for the horrors they had heard about. Thomas stopped them, placing himself between the mob and the prisoner. "British forces use gas too," he said quietly. "We've killed German boys the same way they killed ours. If you want someone to blame, blame the generals who ordered it. Blame the chemists who invented it. But this man is just a soldier like us." Through an interpreter, the German officer told Thomas that German troops feared British gas attacks just as much as British troops feared German attacks. Both sides had chemists working constantly to develop more lethal compounds. Both sides trained their soldiers in gas warfare. Both sides launched attacks whenever wind conditions were favorable. The war had become a nightmare of escalation, each chemical attack justifying the next, each new compound more terrible than the last. The officer looked at Thomas's scarred face and said something in German. The interpreter translated. He says you understand. He says you have seen what we have all become. Orders came down for a British gas attack the following week. Thomas and his section were part of the assault team. They would release gas from cylinders positioned along the front line when the wind turned favorable, then attack through the contaminated ground wearing their respirators. Thomas helped position the cylinders, each one containing hundreds of pounds of pressurized poison. The new soldiers were excited, eager for revenge, seeing this as justice for what the Germans had done. Thomas felt only sick certainty. He knew exactly what this gas would do to the German soldiers in the opposite trenches. He knew they would blister and blind and drown in their own fluids, just as Ellis had, just as Morrison had. And he understood the sick logic that made him complicit. They had to poison the enemy to advance. They had to become the thing they feared. The wind turned favorable on October 23rd, blowing steady toward German lines. Officers gave the order, and men opened the gas cylinder valves. Thomas watched the yellow-brown cloud drift across no man's land, rolling over German trenches like a toxic tide. The British troops advanced behind it, moving through the contaminated zone in their respirators, rifles ready. They found German soldiers dead and dying, some with their masks on too late, others with masks that had failed or been damaged. The injuries were identical to those Thomas had seen in British casualties: the blistered skin, the blind eyes, the fluid-filled lungs. Some of the German soldiers were boys younger than Ellis had been in a captured dugout. Thomas found a notebook lying beside a dead German soldier. The man's face was covered in mustard gas burns, his eyes open and sightless. Thomas picked up the notebook with gloved hands and opened it carefully. Inside were sketches, dozens of faces drawn with careful detail. The German soldier had been doing exactly what Thomas did, preserving the faces of fallen comrades, making sure someone remembered them. The similarity made Thomas's hands shake. There was no difference between them except the color of their uniforms and the direction they faced when they died. The attack succeeded tactically. British forces captured 300 yards of German trench and held it against counterattack. Command called it a victory. Thomas sat in the capture position that night, looking at both notebooks, his own and the Germans', and felt the weight of what mustard gas had done to the war. It had not made killing more efficient in the traditional sense. It had made suffering more efficient. It had turned warfare into an industrial process of systematic destruction, where courage meant nothing, where experience meant nothing, where the only thing that mattered was which way the wind was blowing. That he wrote in his notebook for the first time, not sketching, but putting words on paper. He wrote about Ellis calling for his mother and Morrison gasping out his final warnings. He wrote about the German boy who died asking if his mother had been notified, and the German soldier who had sketched the same faces Thomas sketched. He wrote about how mustard gas represented everything the war had become: impersonal, inescapable, designed to maximize suffering rather than achieve military objectives. Chemical warfare turned soldiers into weapons turned against themselves, their own bodies becoming the battlefield where the real war was fought. Orders came down for another gas attack scheduled for the following week. The cycle continued. The silent horror continued. Thomas looked at the scarred faces of men around him, at the contaminated earth beneath his feet, at the yellow-stained sky where clouds and poison clouds had become indistinguishable. Mustard gas had redefined the brutality of war, not through its lethality, but through its cruelty, creating a weapon that did not grant the dignity of quick death, but instead prolonged suffering into an art form. And both sides would continue using it, because neither could afford to stop first, because stopping meant giving the enemy an advantage, because the logic of total war demanded that every weapon be used regardless of what it cost in human terms. Thomas understood now that he would survive the war, but would never escape it. The gas would live in his damaged lungs, in his nightmares, in every breath that came a little harder than it should. He would carry mustard gas forward into whatever peace eventually came, a walking reminder of what humanity had created and chosen to use again and again. That was the true aftermath of poison. It did not just kill bodies. It killed the possibility of forgetting, of pretending war was anything other than systematic human destruction elevated to an industrial scale.